Hey boys and girls, we're going to pick back up with our reading of the BFG today. And I thought I'd move to a different location in my house. So I'm sitting in my comfy bed, got my comfy clothes on. So we're going to settle down and read. Yesterday we learned that there are more giants in Giant Country and they are not very nice. The BFG was telling Sophie about the ones who go off to different foreign lands and gobble up human beings. And it's really best if Sophie never goes outside the cave, because if she does, it is not going to be good for her. And then when we ended up reading in our last chapter, we found out that the giant is hungry. And so we're going to find out today what a non-human being eating giant actually eats for food. This chapter starts out, it's called Snozzcumbers. But if you don't eat people like all the others, Sophie said, then what do you live on?
That is a squelching, tricky problem around here, the BFG answered. In this slosh-flunking giant country, happy eats like pineapples and piggy winkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except for one extremely icky-poo vegetable. It is called a snozzcumber.
The snozzcumber, cried Sophie. There's no such thing. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing about 20 of his square white teeth.
Yesterday, he said, we was not believing in giants, was we? Today we is not believing in snozzcumbers. Just because we happen not to have actually seen something with our own two little winkles, we think it is not existing. What about, for instance, the great squizzly Scotch hopper?
I beg your pardon, Sophie said.
And the humplecrick.
What's that? Sophie said.
And the rapscrapple.
The what? Sophie said.
And the crumscottle.
Are those animals? Sophie asked.
They is common animals, said the BFG contemptuously. I is not very know-all giant myself, but it seems to me that you is an absolutely know-nothing human being. Your brain is full of rotten wool.
You mean cotton wool? Sophie said.
What I mean and what I say is two different things, the BFG announced rather grandly. I will now show you a snozzcumber.
The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long again as an ordinary man, but was much thicker. It was as thick around its girth as a perambulator. It was black with white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles. And here's a little picture of the BFG holding a snozzcumber.
Here is the repulsant snozzcumber, cried the BFG, waving it about. I squoggle it, I despise it, I desponge it. But because I is refusing to gobble up human beings like the other giants, I must spend my life guzzling up icky-poo snozzcumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and groans.
You mean skin and bones? Sophie said.
I know it is bones, the BFG said, but please understand that I cannot be helping it if I sometimes is saying things a little squiggly. I is trying my very best all the time.
The big friendly giant looked suddenly so forlorn that Sophie got quite upset. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to be rude.
They never was any schools to teach me talking in giant country, the BFG said sadly.
But couldn't your mother have taught you? Sophie asked.
My mother? Cried the BFG. Giants don't have mothers. Surely you is knowing that. I did not know that, Sophie said. Who ever heard of a woman giant? Shouted the BFG, waving the snozcumber around his head like a lasso. There never was a woman giant, and there never will be one. Giants is only men. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, she said, how were you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appears, and that's all there is to it. They simply appears, the same way as the sun and the moon. And when did you appear? Sophie asked. Now, how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that? Said the BFG. It was so long ago, I can't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that, the BFG said. All I is knowing about myself is I is old, very, very old and crumply, perhaps as old as the earth. What happens when a giant dies? Sophie asked. Giants is never dying, the BFG answered. Sometimes and quite suddenly a giant is disappearing and nobody is ever knowing where he goes to. But mostly us giants is simply going on and on and on like whiskey-time twiddlers. The BFG was still holding the awesome snozcumber in his right hand, and now he put one end into his mouth and he bit off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like the crunching of lumps of ice. Now, what do you think a snozcumber tastes like? In my mind, I picture it being something like a cucumber, because snozcumber sounds kind of like cucumbers, and it kind of looked like one in the picture. So let's see if he can describe it to us. It is filthy, he spluttered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of snozcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped around on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. It's disgustorous, the BFG gurgled. It's sickable. It's rotsome. It's maggot-wise. Try it yourself, this foulsome snozcumber. No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away. It's all you're going to be guzzling around here from now on, so you might as well get used to it, said the BFG. Go on, you snipsy little winkle, have a go. Sophie took a small nibble. Ugh! She spluttered. Oh, no! Oh, gosh! Oh, help! She spat it out quickly. It tastes like frog skins, she gasped, and rotten fish. Worse than that, cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. To me, it's tasting of clock coaches and slime wanglers. Do we really have to eat it? Sophie said. You do, unless you is wanting to become so thin you'll be disappearing into a thick ear. Into thin air, Sophie said. A thick ear is something quite different. Once again, that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. Words, he said, is oh such a tickling problem to me all my life. So you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I'm telling you before, I know exactly what words I'm wanting to say, but somehow or other they is always getting squiddled around. That happens to everyone, Sophie said. Not like it happens to me, BFG said. I is speaking the most terrible wigglish. I think you speak beautifully, Sophie said. You do? Cried the BFG, suddenly brightening. You really do? Simply beautifully, Sophie repeated. Well, that is the nicest present anybody has ever given me my whole life, cried the BFG. Are you sure you is not twiddling my legs? Here's a picture of the BFG spitting out the snozcumber and little teeny weeny Sophie right here trying to dodge all the spit. Of course not, Sophie said. I just love the way you talk. How wondercrump, cried the BFG, still beaming. How wopsy splunkers, how absolutely squiffling, I is all a stutter. Listen, Sophie said, we don't have to eat snozzcumbers. In the fields around our villages, there's all sorts of lovely vegetables, like cauliflowers and carrots. Why don't you go get some of those next time you are visiting? The BFG raised his great head proudly in the air. I is a very honourable giant, he said. I would rather be chewing up rotsome snozzcumbers than snitching things from other people. You stole me, Sophie said. I just did not steal you very much, said the BFG, smiling gently. After all, you is only a tiny little girl. The blood bottler. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, Runt! Is you there, Runt? I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt? Look out, cried the BFG. It's the blood bottler. But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and twice as wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten snozzcumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering above the BFG. Who is you jabbling to in here just now? He boomed. I is jabbling to myself, the BFG answered. Piffle fizz, shouted the blood bottler. Bug swallop, he boomed. You is talking to a human being. That's what I is thinking. No, no, cried the BFG. Yes, yes, boomed the blood bottler. I is guessing you has snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper. And if you pictured the blood bottler, did he look like this? The poor BFG was very nervous. There's no one in here, he stammered. Why won't you leave me alone? The blood bottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. Runty little scrum-screwer, he shouted. Piffling little swish-figgler, squimpy little bottle-wart, prunty little pogswizzler. I is now going to search the primroses. He grabbed the BFG by the arm. And you is going to help me to do it. Us together is going to winkle out this tasteful little human being, he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back. But now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous snozzcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The blood bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish-brown. There was black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy-looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small and flat, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across his face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of another. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The blood bottler still held the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles. You and your pibbling bottles, he shouted. What is you putting in them? Nothing that would interest you, the BFG answered. You is only interested in guzzling human beings. "And you is a dotty as a dog's waggler," cried the blood bottler. Soon the blood bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She would break her leg. The snozzcumber, although it was thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide her if the blood bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed off end. It had large seeds in the middle, and each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of those seeds. This left a hole in the middle of the snozzcumber large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself up into a ball. She crawled into it. It was wet and slimy, quite the hiding place, but what did that matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The blood bottler and the BFG were coming back toward the table now. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the blood bottler grabbed the half-eaten snozzcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. "Sophie, where is you?" he thought desperately. "You cannot possibly be jumping off that high table, so where is you hiding, Sophie?" "So this is the filsome, rotsome glubbage you is eating," boomed the blood bottler, holding up the partly eaten snozzcumber. "You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub squash." For a moment, the blood bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track. "That is the scrumdiddlyumptious snozzcumber," he said. "I is guzzling it gleefully every day and night. Is you never try a snozzcumber, blood bottler?" "Human beans is juicier," said the blood bottler. "You is talking rummy tot," the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. "I is happy to let you sample it," the BFG went on. "But please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchet for my supper." The blood bottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the snozzcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. "You is not switch fiddling me, is you?" said the blood bottler. "Never!" cried the BFG passionately. "Take a bite. I am positive you will be shouting out, 'Oh, how scrumdiddlyumptious this wonder veg is.'" The BFG could see the greedy blood bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. "Vegetables is very good for you," he went on. "It is not healthsome always to be eating meaty things." "Just this once," the blood bottler said, "I is going to taste this rotsome eats of yours, but I is warning you that if it is filsome, I is smashing it over your sludgy little head." He picked up the snozzcumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up into the air. Sophie wanted to scream, "Don't!" but that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up, up, up into the air, and suddenly there was a crunch as the blood bottler bit off a huge chunk of the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. "Ew!" roared the blood bottler. And then he spat. All of the great lumps of snozzcumbers that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would have most certainly been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. You little swine bugler, roared the blood bottler. You little pig swiller. He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the snozzcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable splashed all over the cave. You is not loving it? The BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. Loving it, yelled the blood bottler. That is the most disgusterous taste that is ever touching my teeth. You must be buggles to be swallowing sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off happy as a hamburger and gobbling juiced human beings. Eating human beings is wrong and evil, the BFG said. It is guzzly and glumptious, shouted the blood bottler, and tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human chili beans. Is you wishing to know why I is choosing Chile? I is not wishing to know anything, the BFG said, very dignified. I is choosing Chile, the blood bottler said, because I is fed up with the taste of Esquimos. It is important that I has plenty of cold eats in this scuddling hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Esquimau is a chili bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly. Horrible, the BFG said. You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school childlers, the blood bottler said. I is very fond indeed of English school chidlers. They has a nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them. You is disgusting, the BFG said. And you is an insult to the giant peoples, shouted the blood bottler. You is not fit to be a giant. You's a squinky little squiddler. You's a pibbling little pitsqueak. You is a cream puff nut. With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. Sophie, he whispered. Sophie, where is you, Sophie? Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. I'm here, she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hands. Oh, I is so happy to be finding you all in one lump, he said. I was in his mouth, Sophie said. You was what? Cried the BFG. Sophie told him what had happened. And there I was telling him to eat the filsome snozzcumber, and you was in there the whole time inside of it, the BFG cried. Not much fun, Sophie said. Just look at you, you poor little chidler, cried the BFG. You is all covered in snozzcumber and giant spit. He set about cleaning her up the best that he could. I is hating those giants more than ever now, he said. You know what I should like? What? Sophie said. I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one. I'd be glad to help you, Sophie said. Let me see if I can't think of a way of doing it. I think for there we will go ahead and stop because tomorrow the next two chapters are my favorites. You're going to find out about Frobscottle and Whiz Poppers. So come back tomorrow and join me as we read more of the BFG. Have a great day.